Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about Jupiter's moon Europa, specifically whether Europa is habitable and whether it is inhabited. So let's get started. So what we're going to be talking about in this video is Europa's habitability, specifically the presence of water, CHNOPS elements, or carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur elements, and energy on Europa that could be harnessed by life. Then we'll talk a little bit about the possible biogeochemical cycles and metabolic pathways that life could have on Europa or icy moons like Europa. And some of these include sulfate reduction and methanogenesis. And then we'll talk about the difference between Europa's habitability versus it actually being inhabited and how we can look for those two different things in different ways and the possibility for a second origin of life on Europa. So first, is Europa habitable? Well, let's look at what we know about the conditions on Europa. So here at the bottom right, we have a ternary diagram showing the three essentials for life. These are water, the CHNOPS elements, like I just mentioned on the previous slide, and energy. And let me just emphasize here that these are the three essentials for life as we know it. There might be funky life out there that maybe doesn't need liquid water. Maybe it uses liquid methane on Titan as its solvent. But for what we know, water, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and energy are all essential for life. So we're going to be talking today about the possible habitability of Europa based on life as we know it. Meaning that even if some of the conditions on Europa aren't super favorable for life as we know it, they might actually be favorable for life as we don't know it, or weird, funky life that uses different processes and different materials than the life that we know here on Earth. So let's get into the habitability of Europa. In terms of water, Europa has even more water than Earth, actually, and it's not all ice. Yes, Europa is an ice-covered moon. It has an icy shell that may be many kilometers deep, but there is a liquid, salty ocean under that icy surface. And underneath the liquid water ocean, there's a rocky seafloor that may introduce a variety of elements to the ocean. Fingers crossed, because this is really important for CHNOPS. These are the types of elements that we're hoping that rocky seafloor interacting with the water ocean introduces to the water ocean. And that's because once you have those bioessential elements, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, somebody count how many times I say those elements in this video. Once you have those, life becomes possible because this variety of compounds is what's important for creating the energy that life needs to harness to be able to maintain, grow, and reproduce itself. So in terms of these three essentials for life, we know that water is not a limiting factor on Europa. There is plenty of it, so life is not constrained by the amount of water available on Europa. So are there bioessential elements that might be limiting factors for life on Europa? Well, from what we've detected so far and predicted from models of formation of Europa, probably not. At least not for carbon, nitrogen, or sulfur for sure. And we'll talk about each one of these elements and why they're probably not limited in their availability on Europa in a second. But in terms of phosphorus and hydrogen and oxygen, or oxidants, those could be limiting factors, and we'll talk about why in a second as well. And the third essential for life is energy. Is energy a limiting factor for life on Europa? Well, that depends, and what a sciencey answer that is. So we'll talk about why the availability of energy on Europa depends in a few slides, but first let's go over each one of these bioessential elements and why they're so abundant, or why they might be limited in their availability. First, carbon. Carbon is actually more abundant on the Galilean satellites than it is on Earth, and this group of Galilean satellites is just a group of moons that includes Europa. So Europa has more carbon than Earth does, and this is because with increasing distance from the sun, relative abundance of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur increases on moons and planets due to reasons we talked about in the solar system formation video. Basically, it just has to do with how the solar system formed and the temperature variations close to the sun versus far away from the sun. Those elements farther away from the sun were able to condense and form onto planets more easily than those closer to the the sun because those were blasted out by high temperatures. So if you want to learn more about solar system formation and why that happened, you can click up here and watch that solar system formation video. But in terms of carbon on Europa, is the carbon in the right form for life to use? Well, there are a variety of compounds that have been detected and or predicted on Europa's surface, but the question is whether the surface compounds are cycled through to the underlying ocean. This is what's important for life because the ocean is where the life would be. So if the compounds on the surface aren't able to go into the ocean and cycle through, then that would be bad news for the possibility of life on Europa. So we'll talk about that importance of cyclic processes much more later in the video. But if these cycles are happening, carbon is not a limited nutrient for life on Europa. There is more than enough carbon to go around on this moon. But one thing should be noted, and that is the depth where the liquid ocean on Europa starts is so deep because the ice cover is so thick that the pressure and temperature conditions are such that calcium carbonate would not be stable precipitating. So it would dissolve in the ocean, and therefore calcium carbonate skeleton building organisms like we have here on Earth's ocean likely wouldn't actually be on Europa. It's still a possibility in isolated locations where pH and pressure temperature conditions are wacky on Europa, but it's more likely that life is using carbon in different forms than calcium carbonate. So what about nitrogen? Nitrogen is another element likely to be abundant on Europa. And we know from life on Earth, the nitrogen cycle is absolutely crucial. Nitrogen gas from Earth's atmosphere has to be fixed or transformed into some sort of organic or dissolved nitrogen like ammonium or nitrate for most of biology to actually use. And those few organisms that actually fix the nitrogen from the atmosphere are really important for kicking off the rest of the nitrogen cycle until finally denitrifying organisms can then take the dissolved nitrogen and make it back into nitrogen 2 and release it back into the atmosphere where the cycle starts all over again. However, unlike Earth, Europa's nitrogen cycle likely wouldn't involve the atmosphere at all. No nitrogen 2 is likely present on Europa because of its thin and tenuous atmosphere, and because nitrogen 2 that forms at the surface of Europa is just kicked off into space anyway. So this actually removes the need for biology or some other process to fix nitrogen in order for biology to use it on Europa, which is actually maybe an advantage for life there. So this means that the prominent forms of nitrogen, just based on the abundance of nitrogen from our models of Europa's formation, are likely ammonia and dissolved ammonium and nitrate, like we saw over here, that biology could use. But like carbon, these nitrogen compounds would have to be cycled through some sort of oceanic surface seafloor cycle that could allow the regeneration of used or transformed nitrogen compounds to continue to feed life's needs. So the need for cycles is really important, and you'll see me repeat that over and over again in this lecture till we really get to the bottom of if there are cycles on Europa at the end of this lecture. So stick around, we'll talk about cycles more because they're really important. Now moving on to phosphorus. Phosphorus was one of those elements on the limiting factors for life slide that is possibly a limiting factor. But let's talk about why. Models of Europa's formation predict that phosphorus is present on Europa, which is great. And the amount of phosphorus in Europa's ocean is estimated to be similar to that of phosphorus in Earth's ocean, which is great because Earth does have life and phosphorus is necessary for life. But phosphorus is a limiting element for life on Earth. The problem on Earth, and likely also on Europa, is not so much about the total amount of phosphorus available as it is about the relative insolubility of phosphorus compared to the other bioessential elements. Phosphorus likes to be in the geosphere, aka rocks. It doesn't necessarily love to be dissolved in water, and it doesn't even have an atmospheric component or gaseous component in Earth's phosphorus cycle. And this is likely the same case on Europa. Phosphorus is likely tied up in the rocks or geosphere of Europa, and only a little bit is available in dissolved forms for life to actually use. And what do I mean by a little bit? Well, dissolved phosphate on Earth only accounts for about 0.007 weight% of total phosphorus on Earth. So that's about how much dissolved or bioavailable phosphorus on Earth there is compared to the total amount of phosphorus on Earth. So are there alternatives for phosphorus that could be readily bioavailable and used instead of phosphorus for life on Europa? Well, alternatives like citric acid, arsenic acid, silicic acid, and sulfate have all been investigated as alternatives for phosphorus in life's processes, but none are quite as advantageous as phosphate is when it comes to building our genetic material and our ATP. Remember that ATP is the energy of life. That's adenosine triphosphate, and the P stands for phosphate. So phosphorus is likely the best when it comes to other alternatives. And this is because phosphate is trivalent, allowing it to provide two bonds for building polymers and still have a remaining negative charge that keeps it within the cell's membrane and protects it from hydrolysis or degradation. And this provides long-term stability. Long-term stability is so important when it comes to life because then life can be stable for long enough to grow and reproduce and go about its functions. And so that's really, really important. That's why phosphorus is number one. However, alternatives to phosphorus in phospholipids, replacing the phosphorus with sulfur to make sulfolipids, has been observed in some funky bacteria on Earth. So it's not impossible that life on Europa could evolve a liking for phosphorus alternatives in phosphate depleted conditions. So I'm not ruling it out, but I am saying that since phosphorus is just as saturated in Europa's oceans as it is our own, life on Europa likely uses phosphorus to produce genetic material and ATP and all the things that phosphorus is great for. So is it a limiting factor? Maybe. But would it absolutely prevent life on Europa? Absolutely not. What about sulfur? Well, sulfur is one of those that is, again, easy to just rule out as a limiting factor because it's probably super abundant on Europa. And not just probably, it is. We've detected it, we've measured it. Europa's surface is absolutely dominated by sulfur and water. And this sulfur on the surface of Europa is actually both indigenous and exogenous sulfur. Indigenous means it's coming from Europa, the source is Europa, which is great because we know that Europa should have had sulfur upon formation. And exogenous means that some of this sulfur is coming from external sources like meteorites or sulfur-rich plumes from Europa's neighbor Io, which is another awesome moon of Jupiter that is actually the most volcanically active body in our solar system, which is pretty freaking awesome. So I'll probably have a video about Io at some point as well. But in terms of Europa's sulfur, it has a variety of oxidation states just like we see here on Earth, from +6 to -2. What does oxidation state mean? Well, it's just basically like the charge or valency of sulfur in the compound, and you don't need to understand the chemistry of it for this lecture, but I am going to talk about reduced versus oxidized compounds later. And reduced just means a more negative oxidation state, and oxidized means a more positive oxidation state. So this range in oxidation states is really important for providing possible metabolic pathways on Europa. And we'll talk about what that means later as well. But the question or the possible problem here is that in order to do this, these compounds, this variety of compounds available at the surface of Europa, from what we can tell, has to be cycled through the ocean and seafloor and then the surface again to actually provide life with regenerated sulfur compounds for life to continue to live on. And this likely happens, but the type of life present on Europa is heavily dependent on whether Europa's ocean cycles more heavily with the seafloor versus whether it cycles more heavily with the icy surface. AKA more oxidized sulfur compounds like sulfate at the surface would be dominant in the ocean if it cycles more heavily with the icy shell versus if it cycles more heavily with the sea floor, more reduced compounds like sulfide would be dominant in the ocean. This would cause a major difference in the type of life present on Europa, but we'll talk more about that later as well when we get to energy. So you may have noticed that we talked about carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, but what about oxygen and hydrogen? Well, for a discussion of oxygen and hydrogen, we actually need to talk a little bit about the requirement of energy for life, because this will bring us to the discussion of oxidants and reductants, which is where we'll get into compounds containing oxygen and hydrogen that are really important for life and whether they're present and abundant on Europa. So we know that life needs to grow, reproduce, and just plain live. So all of these processes require energy, continuous energy. And to gain this energy, cells and us and every living thing on Earth undergoes something called metabolism. Metabolism is the chemical reactions that we use, living things use, to gain energy and to continue living, growing, and reproducing. This energy that is required for life might be a limiting factor for life on Europa. But like we talked about previously, that depends. So first, let's talk a little bit about energy, and then we'll talk about why it depends. So I discuss energy in terms of thermodynamics in the igneous rock textures video, which is quite different than this video. But if you want to check it out in the section on thermodynamics, you can just click here and then go to the thermodynamics chapter. But the same basic concept that gives free energy needs to be negative for energy to be released and for a reaction to occur spontaneously also applies to metabolic reactions, not only crystallization reactions like we talked about in that video. So here on these graphs, we can see that when G is negative or less than 0, the ball will roll down the hill because that's energetically favorable. That is an exergonic reaction. Energy is released, and these are the types of reactions that life wants to harness. And an endergonic reaction, as shown in the bottom graph, shows a ball rolling up the hill. This takes energy. You can imagine that something would have to push the ball up the hill. That something is energy. That means that the Gibbs free energy is positive, and that reaction will not occur spontaneously. It won't occur until the energy required for it to occur is provided. So life harnesses exergonic reactions to gain energy for processes such as endergonic reactions that they need to carry out to grow, reproduce, etc. So in summary, a negative Gibbs free energy is the type of reaction that needs to occur in the environment to release energy for life to harness. So how do we know what types of metabolic reactions are occurring on Europa? Once again, it's all about what compounds are present and the forms that they are in. So what does this mean? Well, metabolism, as discussed in my redox stratification video, I'll link it up here if you want to check it out, is things like oxygen respiration. That is our humans' metabolic pathway. And in oxygen respiration metabolism, we take up oxygen and release carbon dioxide. How do we do this? We use an oxidant, oxygen, and a reductant. In our case, organic carbon. So we use the organic carbon to reduce the oxygen that we breathe in, and then we use the oxygen to oxidize the organic carbon to CO2. And we can see on this redox tower showing a wide variety of reductants and oxidants that oxygen and carbon, the two things that we use, are very different in this value on the side here. You can't see it because my face is covering it, but that value is E, or redox potential, which you don't have to know right now. All you need to know is that their numbers are very different. One is very positive, oxygen, and one is very negative in redox potential. This means that when we combine the two to metabolize, we are gaining a lot of energy from that process. And things that are closer together, for example, the iron down here coupled with the hydrogen up here, would still be a really energetic process, but slightly less different than oxygen and carbon here, so that would yield slightly less energy. And maybe something like sulfate and hydrogen, like right here and here, would yield even less energy, and so on. So you want to be as far apart as you can on that redox tower to yield the most energy. That's besides the point. I'm just pointing out what this redox tower means. But what's important here for energy and for life is that the presence of oxidants and reductants is important for the production of energy on Europa that life could then harness. So are there reductant oxidant pairs on Europa that could produce energy for life? We talked about the bioessential elements, but are they in the right forms, or oxidized or reduced, to be able to pair up and actually produce this energy? Well, the short answer is for reductants, yeah, they're probably super abundant in Europa's ocean. Oxidants, yes, they're abundant, but as far as we know, just on the surface of Europa. Whether they actually are cycled through to the underlying ocean is still up for question, and this would be really, really important for life. If they're not cycled through, the possibility of life as we know it on Europa is pretty low. But if they are cycled through, it's much higher. So how do we know that reductants are likely abundant in Europa's ocean? Well, under the liquid ocean on Europa, you have a rocky seafloor. And this rocky seafloor, due to tidal heating on Europa, is very possibly volcanically active, aka there are hydrothermal vents that could be releasing fluids into the ocean and therefore releasing a whole variety of reductants, reducing compounds into Europa's ocean to cycle through the ocean and provide that reductant half that life needs to create energy. However, in terms of oxidants, the production of oxidants occurs at the icy surface of Europa, where radiolysis, or dissociation of molecules by ionizing radiation, occurs. However, how those oxidants get beneath the ice and into the ocean is still unknown, and one of the main issues in terms of whether life could exist on Europa. Emphasizing once more that a geologically active, or cycling with the seafloor as well as the surface, Europa is really, really important for the habitability of Europa. So now let's just jump ahead and assume that Europa cycles its reductants and oxidants through the ocean, and that they're abundant and available for biology to use for energy production and all of that stuff. So if we assume this, what kind of redox pairs are present and what kind of life might they support? Possible metabolic pathways on Europa, based on what we know about the compounds that are present, are likely sulfur compounds like oxidized sulfate and reduced sulfide, like we talked about, which can couple with hydrogen and water to reduce and oxidize these sulfur compounds in metabolic pathways called sulfate reduction and sulfur oxidation, respectively. Now, like I mentioned, these pathways located around here on the redox tower are not that separated from each other in terms of redox potential. Therefore, they're not that energetically favorable, but they produce enough energy to make life possible. There are plenty of sulfate reducers and sulfur oxidizers here in Earth's oceans, as well as other environments on Earth. Heck, there's even sulfate reducers that live in our stomachs and produce hydrogen sulfide that makes our farts smell. So there you go. They're everywhere here on Earth, so why wouldn't they live on Europa, given that these compounds are cycled through Europa's ocean? Some other examples that I'll just briefly go through now that we've gone through the general concept of metabolism with sulfur compounds are methanogenesis, hydrogen peroxide or oxygen reduction, nitrate reduction and or oxidation depending on the availability of reduced nitrogen, and iron reduction or oxidation. And one more thing I want to mention before we jump into the habitability versus inhabited discussion on the next slide is that although the availability of oxidants on Europa is likely limited depending on surface cycling, there is good news. Even if oxidants are limited in their availability in Europa's ocean, the abiotic reduction of oxidants like sulfate and carbon dioxide is highly unlikely, or if it happens very slowly due to the temperature and pressure conditions present in Europa's ocean. For example, high temperature conditions can abiotically reduce sulfate and take it away from being available to be reduced by biology in Earth's ocean. However, in Europa's, that's highly unlikely based on the cold temperatures of Europa's ocean. So that means that these oxidants, even if they're limited in availability, remain around until a biological process can come along and reduce them, because abiotic processes are highly unlikely. So lastly, I just want to mention that just because Europa is habitable does not mean that it's inhabited. We discussed in this whole video that Europa is likely pretty darn habitable, but whether it's inhabited is still a question that remains unanswered and probably far away in terms of when we're going to figure it out. And another thing that's important to distinguish is that the conditions required to sustain life aren't necessarily the same as those required to start life. I actually talk a lot about the likely conditions that led to life origins on Earth in my Life Origins on Earth video. I'll link it up here if you want to check it out. But basically, these life origins likely occurred in some sort of hydrothermal vent or maybe warm little pond environment where microbes were the first things to originate by compounds coming together in just the right way under just the right energetically favorable conditions. And so how do we determine whether Europa's conditions are favorable for the origin of life, or if maybe Europa's already inhabited. When did conditions on Europa first become favorable for a life origin? And this we can gain from studying the geologic history of Europa, which brings me to the upcoming videos, which are very important, obviously. As emphasized in this video, we talked all about how it's really important for Europa to be geologically active, which is what we're going to be talking about in the upcoming video. We have this question on the thumbnail: is Europa's ice-covered ocean fully ice-covered? That has to do with its geologic activity and cyclic processes like we talked about in this video. So that is what we'll talk about in that video, and then we'll talk about the geologic history, so how Europa's conditions have changed through time based on our knowledge at present, in the following video. So that's it for this video, but thanks so much for watching. And if you want to check out the reference that I'm using to make this video, it is a book called Europa, specifically the chapter written by Doctors Kevin Hand, Christopher Chiba, John Prisco, Robert Carlson, and Ken Nielsen. This is an incredible book, an incredible chapter, and I am in awe at the talent of these scientists. They not only study Europa's amazing conditions, but they also write it in ways that I think are really, really cool and easy to follow. So if you want to check it out, that book will be linked in my description. Other supporting references are also linked down there, and image sources are also always linked down there if you want to check those out. So thanks again for watching, and comment down below for me what other types of worlds or moons or planets you would like to see me do another video about. Bye guys!